Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
In early summer, I visited a relative who lived far away on one of the Shetland Islands. It was summer for me too. I was a young medical student, with my whole life ahead of me, full of hope, happiness, and sadness. I went north to work hard and brought many books with me. I planned to study everything: plants, animals, rocks, and chemistry. But I must admit, I never opened my books even once during the 5 months I stayed at R. If I learned anything, it was from nature, which is always there for anyone to see and learn from. The steamboat took me to Lerwick. From there, I traveled the next day to my relative's house in a small, open boat with my boxes. Finally, we came to an opening in the rocks. It led to a long, winding bay with green fields on both sides. At the end of the bay stood my relative's house. It looked strong and cozy, but there wasn't a single tree around it. I won't stay here long, I thought to myself as I got out of the boat. But just a few hours later, I changed my mind. I was sitting in a warm and comfortable room upstairs. The windows showed a beautiful view of the wide Atlantic Ocean. It was strange. On one side of the house was the bay that led from the German Ocean, and on the other side, just a short distance away, was the Atlantic. Its big, green waves crashed into the dark cliffs below. Some tall, sharp rocks stuck out of the water. Sometimes they looked very high, like church towers, but then the waves almost covered them. By the fire, my old relative, who had gray hair, sat in a soft chair. His wife was nearby. Both of them were kind, warm, and friendly. They looked so perfect for each other that I thought their marriage must have been decided in heaven. Then my cousin Maggie came into the room. She smiled at me and gently touched her father's hair with her hand before sitting down at the piano. I was hidden partly behind the curtain, so I could look at her without being rude. I asked myself, is she beautiful? I wasn't sure. Her face was perfect. She had a small mouth and ears, thick auburn hair, and bright blue eyes like the sea on a sunny day. But I still couldn't decide if she was truly beautiful, because I was related to the family, even though only as a distant cousin. We were third or fourth cousins. They treated me like one of them from the beginning. Maggie acted like I was her brother, but I wasn't completely happy with that. After a few days, I thought it might be fun to fall in love with Maggie. Weeks passed, but I didn't start showing her my feelings. I kept putting it off. Maggie spent a lot of time with me outside. She joined me on all my fishing and hunting trips. She wasn't just watching. She carried her own fishing rod and even a rifle. She taught me how to fish better, and she often caught the seals that I could only injure. She was so strong at rowing the boat, it amazed me. Sometimes she rowed far out into the sea, and I felt nervous about our safety. For the first 2 months of my stay, a young farmer named Magnus often came to visit. He lived on a nearby island and always came with his sister. They usually stayed for a couple of days. I quickly noticed that Magnus liked Maggie very much, but I wasn't sure how Maggie felt about him. After some time, I found out and it happened unexpectedly. One evening, when the moon was shining brightly, I was sitting alone near an old ruin not far from the house. Soon, I saw Maggie and Magnus coming towards the ruins. I decided to hide in the shadows of the wall to surprise them. But I didn't join their conversation. Instead, I saw something I will never forget. Magnus was speaking to Maggie. I couldn't see his face, but the moonlight showed hers clearly. She looked upset. Her face showed pain, fear, and impatience. He told her he loved her and asked her to love him too. At last, she stopped him. I didn't hear everything she said, but in just a few moments, Magnus left. Maggie stood there, watching him walk away. Her eyes followed him with pity. The next day, Magnus said goodbye and left with his sister. Even his sister seemed sad. I think she knew what had happened. I never saw them again. About a month later, Maggie and I were sitting in one of our favorite places, a cave near the ocean. It was a hot morning, and we often went there to cool off. Our boat was close by, and the calm sea made soft, peaceful sounds on the sandy beach. Maggie was reading a book aloud, and I was looking at her face. "I think you are beautiful," I said. She looked at me with her big, innocent eyes, as open and honest as a child's. "I'm not sure," I said with a smile, "but maybe I should start loving you, and maybe I should marry you. What do you think of that?" She laughed, her voice as lovely as music. "Love," she said. "Love between cousins? That's impossible." "I think," I said, pretending to look sad, "you wouldn't marry me because I am poor." "Poor," Maggie repeated. Her face was serious, and she looked very determined. "If the man I loved were poor, I would carry a basket for him. I would even collect shells for him. But I don't love anyone, and I don't plan to love anyone. Let's go." And that was the start and the end of my attempt to make Maggie love me. Maggie said she never planned to love anyone. But we can never know what will happen next in life. We left the cave that day and pushed the boat away from the shore. Small ripples began to form on the water, coming in from the west. Before we reached the far headland, a steady breeze had started to blow. We raised the sail, and the boat moved fast, like a bird flying in the wind. Once we went around the headland, the wind came from the side of the boat. It stayed that way until we entered the fjord. Then we had to sail against the wind all the way back home. By the time we arrived, the wind was very strong, almost a storm. At sunset, the wind changed direction and started coming from the north. That was when we saw a small yacht far away on the horizon. It looked like it was trying to sail around the island and find a safe place to anchor on the other side. But the yacht was in a dangerous spot, and we all watched it with worry until the darkness of night hid it from our view. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. The wind was howling around the house, sounding like wild wolves. At midnight, I suddenly heard a loud sound, a gunshot. I couldn't be mistaken because the windows shook from the noise. I jumped out of bed and started to get dressed. Just then, my old relative came into my room. He looked taller and younger than I had ever seen him, but his face was very serious. "The yacht is on the Ba," he said in a heavy, solemn voice. I knew what those words meant. The Ba was a dangerous, sunken rock. If the yacht was stuck there, it would soon break apart. There was no way to save the crew. I quickly followed my relative into the back sitting room, where Maggie was with her mother. We looked out into the dark night, across the sea. At that moment, a blue light appeared far away on the dangerous rock called the Ba. The light showed the yacht and even the people on it. The yacht was leaning to one side, with its masts broken. Waves were crashing over it. "Come!" Maggie cried. "We don't have time to waste. We can guide their boat to the cave." "Come, cousin." I felt frozen and shocked. Was I really about to help with something so dangerous? And Maggie, how brave and beautiful she looked now. Was she going to act like a real-life Grace Darling? Seems she was. The events of that night are still clear in my memory, as if they happened yesterday. That night will always stay in my mind. Maggie and I rowed our boat out of the fjord and towards the sheltered side of the island. When we turned around the headland, we faced the full power of the wind and the waves. We could see a faint light from the wrecked yacht, and we headed towards it. The wind carried us forward more than we could row. Only a Shetland skiff, a strong and sturdy boat, could survive such rough seas. As we got closer to the Ba, Maggie stood halfway up in the boat, steadying herself by leaning on my shoulder. She waved a lantern, and the light was answered by the people on the yacht. A moment later, we were on the sheltered side of the yacht. Maggie shouted to the people on board. "We can't get closer," she yelled. "Lower your boat and follow our light." Then she turned to me and said, "Take the tiller and steer the boat towards the light on the cliff. Keep the boat steady and a little above the light, or we'll all be lost." We waited, though it was hard to keep still in the rough sea. In a few minutes, we saw the yacht's lifeboat being lowered into the water. Then we began moving again. The light on the cliff slowly moved with the wind. I kept steering the boat, keeping its nose slightly above the light. The waves carried us forward quickly. The black rocks looked tall and dangerous as we came closer, and the waves crashed below with a loud roar. Suddenly, the light was lowered down the cliff to the water's edge. "Steady now," Maggie called out bravely. A moment later, we turned around a rocky point and entered calm water. The yacht's lifeboat was right behind us. The place was like a cave but partly open, a natural shelter. We pulled our boats onto the beach and stayed there for the rest of the night. The next morning, a fisherman's large boat came and rescued all of us. The people from the yacht were the captain, his wife, and their son. The crew were Norwegians, and their family name was Brinster. My story is almost over. There is no need to explain how grateful they were to Maggie for saving their lives from the sea. But a few months later, a beautiful new yacht came to the fjord to take the shipwrecked Brinster family away. Maggie went with them for a visit. When I returned to the following summer, I found 2 new people living in my relative's house. Major Brinster and Mrs. Brinster. Mrs. Brinster was my cousin Maggie. And Major Brinster? He was my cousin Maggie's destiny.